Hello everyone. You've probably realized that when we first started our conversation about anatomy and physiology, we started with atoms and elements, right? And then we moved on from atoms and elements to talk about molecules. So you can snap these things together to form different types of molecules. And some of the molecules we focused on were the macromolecules like proteins, fats, and carbs, but also the micromolecules or micronutrients that they produce like glucose, fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids. But they're still all molecules. And then from molecules, we moved on to cells. And we had a look at the generic structure of cells, the thing that cells share amongst all the different types. And I alluded to the fact that there are many different types of cells. So in actual fact, while we have 30 trillion cells within our body, you'll find that of those 30 trillion cells, we only have around about 200 types of cells. So when I say 200 types, I mean, you've got a bone cell, you've got a cartilage cell, you've got a liver cell, if you counted them all up, there's 200 types. But if you were to group them by function, so we're grouping by function, what you'll end up getting is not cells, but you end up grouping them in accordance to tissues. So if you take cells, group them in accordance to their function, you now get tissues. And this is now the next stage of building up to an entire organism. Atoms, molecules, cells, and now tissues. And so I want to talk about the 4 tissue types in the body. I'm going to introduce you to them. So the very first tissue type I want to talk about is that of nervous tissue. And when I talk about nervous tissue, I'm referring to specifically neurons and glia. They're the 2 major types of nervous tissue. So nervous tissue can be broken up into neurons and glia. Now, glia are they're supporting cells. They actually are there to support the neurons, and the neurons are there to communicate. So at the end of the day, the reason why we have nervous tissue is for communication. It allows for us to send really fast, quick and direct signals to distant parts of the body to tell it what to do or what needs to be done, or to inform us as to what has potentially happened or will happen. So this is nervous tissue. It's there to communicate, and predominantly it's made up of neurons and glia. There's many different types of glia. We'll talk about that in the future. And they are there to support the neurons, and it's the neurons themselves that communicate. The next type of tissue I want to talk about is that of muscle tissue. Now there's actually 3 different types of muscle tissue. You've got skeletal muscle, you've got cardiac muscle, and you've got smooth muscle. They're the 3 different types of muscle that we have. What do each of these muscles do? Well, all of them, so the whole thing that muscle does is it moves stuff. It contracts to perform some sort of work, and that work is often movement. So if we were to take the example of these 3 types, in skeletal muscle, it moves the body. So skeletal muscle is attached to our skeleton. So anytime you walk, talk, sing, jump, dance, whatever it may be consciously, that's skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is part of the heart. And so its job is to pump blood around the body. And then we've got smooth muscle, and this lines the inside of hollow organs. So examples of smooth muscle includes the muscle inside your stomach and intestines, so the muscles all throughout your digestive tract, the muscles of your reproductive system, the muscles inside of your blood vessels, the muscles inside of your renal system, so the tubes associated with your kidneys. They all have muscle inside of them to help push things through. So again, movement. So these are the 3 different muscle types. The next type of tissue I want to talk about is epithelial tissue. Epithelial. Now, epithelial tissue is interesting There's many different types and they look quite different from one another. But the whole point of epithelial tissue is that it forms boundaries. It forms boundaries between structures. So you'll find epithelial tissue anywhere that you want to separate two environments. So lining the external part of our body, i.e. our skin, is epithelia. So what's the boundary? Well, it's the external environment from the internal environment. But if you were to look inside, anytime there's a cavity, that cavity is lined by epithelia. Again, to separate out the environment of the cavity to what's on the other side of that cavity. Now, sometimes you can have epithelia which wants things to cross it. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does. So the form of the epithelia, the way it looks, determines on what it does, on its function. If it's really thin like this and one layer, it wants things to go back and forth through the process of diffusion. If it's a bit thicker like this, well, it means it's going to have organelles inside to do functions. So it's likely going to secrete something or absorb something. And if it's really big and long like this, well, then it's very likely that it's going to secrete something as well. So, because again, it's got all these organelles inside to do stuff, right? It's going to take things on board and it's going to secrete things as well. You can also have many layers. So you can have many layers of those squished ones. Now, if it's one layer, I said it wants things to go through. But if it's many layers of those squished epithelia, it doesn't want things to go through. It's like a brick wall. So it's there for protection. So knowing that, what type of epithelia do you think we have on our skin? It's this one here, the many layers of the squished one, because it's there for protection. What type of epithelia do you think we have in our lung tissue? This one here, because it wants gases to go back and forth. We'll go into more detail about the types of epithelia shortly. Let's just look at the final type of tissue I want you to know, and that is connective tissue. So connective tissue does a couple of things for us. It supports, it binds, it supports, it binds, and it protects. That's what connective tissue does. So you may find it wrapping around an organ to support it. So for example, a lot of our digestive organs have connective tissue around it and then anchor it to the abdominal wall, so it's there for support. But also binds it to make sure all its structures stay in one spot. That's important. But it can also protect it from anything trying to invade. So connective tissue is really important. Amazingly, there's many types of connective tissue. So, for example, bone is connective tissue. Blood is connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. So you can have very solid things like bone, you can have liquid things like blood, and you can have semi-solid things like cartilage as bone. But the thing that, as a connective tissue. But the one thing that they all share is that they're all made up of cells, gels, and fibers. And it's just the cell types that are different, the gels that are different, and the fibers that are different, and their quantities that make it a different type of connective tissue. And again, we'll go into detail there. So here are the 4 different types of tissue.